All right, let's discuss the somatic nervous system, which is really the brain's interface with the rest of the world. Because not only is it responsible for sending all of the brain's commands out to the rest of the body to generate movement, it's also responsible for bringing in all of the sensory information that you take in from the world. So the somatic nervous system senses the rest of the world with sensory neurons. And here we're introducing a little piece of neuroscience jargon, which is afferent, which is the term for nerve fibers that carry information in towards the central nervous system. So afferent means incoming, and afferent nerve fibers are always carrying sensory messages, information from the world around us. There's an amazing diversity of types of sensory receptors throughout the body. In your skin, there are receptors that detect different types of touch and stimulation. Inside your eye, on the retina, there are sensors that pick up light rays. Inside your ear, inside the cochlea, there are sensors that have tiny vibrating sela that pick up the vibrations of the air around you, which is what allows you to hear. So there's a wide diversity in terms of the types of sensory neurons that are carrying this afferent information into the brain for processing, but they're all headed in one direction, which is in and up towards the central nervous system. The somatic nervous system also controls our voluntary motion with motor neurons, which exit the spinal cord and synapse directly onto muscles in the body where they release neurotransmitters that make those muscles contract and enable our body to move. And the term for these types of nerve fibers that are carrying commands away from the central nervous system is efferent. Efferent nerves carry outgoing messages from the brain to the body. So one thing we've learned in this class is that the human nervous system's organization kind of echoes some of the animals in our evolutionary past. In particular, we found out when we discussed the enteric nervous system that its structure, a loose net, is very similar to the earliest nervous systems that evolved in jellyfish and sea anemones long, long ago. The organization of the somatic nervous system that allows our body to move and sense the world is based on this idea of bilateral symmetry and a segmented nerve trunk, which we saw evolve with the flatworm. So within the flatworm's body, matched pairs of nerves radiating from a central point allow it to create this undulating motion. And it's basically an advancement of that simple design that allows the human body to move as it does. And if you look at the structure of the somatic nervous system, it really echoes that nervous system of this flatworm with matched pairs of nerves radiating out from the spinal cord to control the body's movement. What you can't see well in this particular image are that some of these nerves are actually coming directly out of the base of the brain, and those are what is known as the cranial nerves. Here's what they look like in action, spreading out throughout your face to both control the motion of your face and to bring in sensory information from the many sense organs that reside on the human skull, such as the ears, eyes, and mouth. So your text provides this image that gives a detailed description of the functions performed by each cranial nerve. Let me get myself out of the way so you can see it. Anatomy students have a grand old time memorizing the names and functions of all these cranial nerves, but that's not really necessary for our purposes. What you should observe is that the cranial nerves carry messages both to and from all of the parts of the human face. Now there is one cranial nerve that we're already familiar with. Take a look and see if you can identify this familiar and important nerve. It's the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, which we learned is crucial to the connection between the brain and the enteric nervous system. Moving down from the cranial nerves that emerge directly from the skull, we have the spinal cord and the spinal nerves that emerge from it. And you can see here these matched pairs of nerves coming out of each side of the spinal cord. Okay, so this image provides a bit of a different view. It would be right here in between each vertebrae where the spinal nerves would emerge and travel to the parts of the body which they're responsible for sensing. Traditionally, the human spine is divided into a couple of segments. We have the cervical spine up at the top, the thoracic spine in the center, the lumbar spine near the bottom, and then finally the sacral spine is at the bottom. And then the nerves that emerge from each section of the spine are named similarly. So cervical nerves come out of the top, thoracic nerves come out of the middle, and so on. And you've probably encountered these terms if you've had physical therapy or yoga. They're common ways to describe these regions. So this is an image from your text illustrating the dermatomes, which are the specific areas of the body controlled by each segment of the spine. So here we see that the cervical nerves coming right out of the top of the back of your neck travel down the arm, and they're responsible for both moving your arm and carrying incoming sensations from your fingertips to your. To understand this next bit of information about how the spinal nerves are organized, you've got to imagine that we've taken a human body and chopped it in half and tilted it forward so that we can look at the spine like this. So this would be the back of the person's body, this would be the front of the person's body. In other words, they're standing sort of like this when we're looking at this particular cross-section of the spine. Incoming sensory information enters the spine through the dorsal root. And dorsal is simply the anatomy term for the back of the body. So sensory information is coming in through the back of your spinal column. Motor commands, on the other hand, come out of the front of the spine and travel out to the rest of the body. Incidentally, this cool little bit of anatomical organization is known as the Law of Bell and McGinty. It's simply named after the old-time dude who discovered it. So all of this information about the organization of the somatic nervous system is relevant when it comes to figuring out where particular nerve impulses enter the spine, which can be helpful in medical contexts. So, if a bee stings me on the front of my knee, where does that incoming sensory signal enter my spine? What do we need to think about to figure out this answer? So first we have to consider which spinal segment would be responsible for receiving that sensory signal. So if we take a look at the image of the human body here, you see that the afferent signals that would be coming from the front of the knee are going to be entering in the lumbar spine. We've also got to consider the law of Bell and McGinty. We know that this incoming sensory information is going to be entering at the back of the spine. So it's on the dorsal root of the lumbar spine. In other words, the back side of my spine in the lower half of my back, where this afferent information would enter the central nervous system and let me know that I'm in trouble because a bee just stung me. We can apply the same information to figure out which nerve fibers would be carrying the efferent motor commands for any particular part of the body. So if I want to, let's say, wiggle my big toe, the signal travels from my brain to the spinal cord and then exits from the lumbar spine in the front this time and executes that command to wiggle my big toe. One cool feature of the somatic nervous system is that in certain instances of intense sensation, it's actually capable of enabling an instant response from the body without the involvement of the brain. And that happens through something called the reflex arc, which is a way that sensory neurons have of communicating with motor neurons through just a tiny connection inside the human spine. So let's take a look at how this works.
The simplest arcs will need only two neurons, a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. But many reflex arcs also have a connecting neuron in the spinal cord called a relay or interneuron. If you take a cross-section of the spinal cord, you will see white and gray matter, as well as all the spinal nerves that branch to the sides of the spinal cord. The dorsal or back side of the spinal cord is here, and the ventral or belly side of the spinal cord is here. A simple 3-neuron pain withdrawal reflex arc works like this. The pain stimulus causes an impulse in the sensory neuron, which has an axon that reaches all the way to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. There it synapses with an interneuron, which sends a message to the motor neuron at the end of the ventral horn. The long axon of the motor neuron synapses with the muscles that will contract and pull the finger away from the painful stimulus. So that's stimulus, to sensory neuron to interneuron to motor neuron to the effector cell. This happens quickly, in just fractions of a second. And because the response goes to the spinal cord and not to the brain, it'll happen without having to think about it.
So to recap, that message traveled along a sensory neuron into the spinal cord, where a tiny interneuron, one very simple part of the central nervous system, sent the command directly to the motor neuron to take your finger away from the source of the pain. Now, in the meantime, this same sensory signal was sent up to the brain along a different pathway. But your finger didn't have to wait for a command from the central nervous system, which can take a bit of time to arrive, before it enacted the pain-reducing motion of jerking your hand away. So if you've ever heard the phrase running like a chicken with its head cut off, which incidentally is definitely a thing that real chickens can do, I come from farm people, it is the reflex arc that enables this. So when the chicken's brain is no longer connected to its body, its organs can still execute really simple movement commands based on this reflex arc enabled by afferent and efferent neurons communicating through the spinal cord alone. It's kind of cool.